To put it in a nutshell, I would like to say that when I started working on this book, other scholars had just started to think about the place of the voice in the theatre. And that scholarship fed directly into my own very personal interest in the sound of English, and especially the sound of English in performance. As a non-native speaker, I'm very fond of the standard English that I learned from my teachers, which is also the English that one gets to hear on the Shakespearean stage. But having learned that English in rural Tuscany, where I grew up, when I moved to the UK and I started to teach English, I became very aware of a tension between the sound of that English and my own accent, especially when I was teaching Shakespeare, when I felt that my accent would, if I got it right, would bolster my credentials as a Shakespeare scholar. That pressure, I realized later on, was not very different from the expectation that all classically trained actors face when they also get to a point when they realize that they have to sound right on stage. Christopher Ecclestone has repeatedly complained about the fact that his northern accent, which is so deeply linked to his artistic persona, has excluded him from mainstream revivals of the classics on the English stage. Even Papa Essiedu, who played Hamlet to great popular and critical acclaim in RSC production of Hamlet in 2016, has spoken in interviews about the symbolic violence that he associates with current training methods that have led him to lose the Ghanaian inflection in his voice to conform to the standard English that he then speaks on stage. So having become aware of this tension, I guess I was primed to be particularly kind of sensitive to the sound of Shakespeare on stage. And the one production that for me represented a real turning point, a key moment, was a production of Two Gentlemen of Verona performed by a London-based company called Two Gents. That was back in 2008 at Opal House Theatre. I had by then enjoyed other productions of Shakespeare's in languages other than English, or productions in English non-standard pronunciation. But this production made me hear Shakespeare as I'd never heard it before. Tonderai Munievo and Denton Chikura, who played all roles in Two Gentlemen of Verona, inflected Shakespeare's language with a warm, lush Zimbabwean accent. It was simply electrifying. Their rendition of the famous song, Who is Sylvia, What is She?, accompanied by the evocative sound of a thumb piano, made a lasting impression on me. This production, in other words, helped me realize that acoustic diversity was a plus, not a minus, and that there was a lot to be gained by encouraging theatre artists to work with accents, to curate accents as carefully as any other aspects of a theatrical production, and to focus on voice as much as we're now focusing on race and gender to diversify the Shakespearean stage. That defining moment led me to research the book, and I made several exciting discoveries along the way. But probably the most exciting was finding out that the original Shakespearean stage was just as diverse, acoustically speaking, and self-consciously so, as I would wish our Shakespearean stage were nowadays. So on the one hand, I was surprised to find out that Shakespeare's own actors were using emerging standards of pronunciation and thereby sounding more elevated than their own social status, which was quite lowly at the time. And those who attacked the theatre for being immoral were especially offended by the fact that actors did not only look like their social superiors by wearing clothes discarded by the court, but they also sounded like the social superiors, and they found that deeply offensive and unorthodox. At the same time, though, by studying variation in the phonetic spelling preserved in the early modern editions of Shakespeare's plays, I realized that Shakespeare's own actors also did use national and regional accents that therefore departed from the emerging standards of proper pronunciation. And they did so to qualify and nuance dramatic situation and characterization. So in chapter 4 in my book, I explained why, for example, it makes sense for Edgar to switch to a southwestern English accent that would have sounded rustic and uncouth to Shakespeare's original audiences when he is confronted by Oswald in Act 4, Scene 5. Or why we shouldn't assume that Sir Hugh Evans, the Welsh parson in Mary Wise of Windsor, is the butt of the joke because of his accent, as we normally do, while Dr. Chaos, the French doctor, is generally an incompetent speaker. Evans speaks with the accent that would not have been an accent that would not have been automatically associated with a rustic clown. Besides, if one looks closer, Evans, you can see how Evans delights in puns and is linguistically more skillful than many of the native speakers of English in this comedy. Even more crucially, though, I was struck by the fact that the Shakespearean stage was acoustically diverse. And that, I think, should serve as an additional incentive on top of the need to diversify the stage and to develop new audiences on the contemporary Shakespearean stage. And I must say, there have been already some really interesting productions, besides the one I've just talked about by two gents, where accents are curated carefully and to great dramatic and theatrical effect, I think. One of these productions, which is the cover image of my book, is Iqbal Khan's 2015 production of Othello for the Royal Shakespeare Company, where Hugh Corshi played Othello in standard English pronunciation alongside Iago, played by Lucian Samati, who spoke his lines in a light Tanzanian accent, and Ayesha Dharka played Emilia in a British Indian accent. So the sheer range of accents in this production, alongside Khan's thought-provoking update, turned Shakespeare's tragedy into a world that looked and sounded more like our own world, and made Othello's tragedy seem more touching and more relevant and much closer to the multicultural world that we inhabit. In the same spirit, my book argues in favor of using original pronunciation, not as an exercise in acoustic archaeology, but to try or to try and reconstruct what Shakespeare must have sounded like to his original audiences, because that is simply not possible. But to diversify the acoustic experience of listening to Shakespeare in the theatre. A great inspiration for me was a pioneering radio producer called Mary Hope Allen, who used OP, original pronunciation, to represent or recast Shakespeare to radio audiences in the late 1930s and early 1940s. And she was trying to reach large audiences that was not for select academic audiences. Evidence of that is that once the programs went out and they got really good feedback from listeners, they were broadcast for children a few months later. So the original pronunciation in that instance, and I think again it should be an inspiration to us, was used to play with the sound of Shakespearean performance. I would like to finish by saying that this sense of playfulness is important, and doing this historical survey of the history of the acoustic reception of Shakespeare on the English stage made me realize that a lot of the great actors who changed the course of the history of the performance of Shakespeare on the English stage were so successful despite the fact that they had a non-standard accent, or probably because they sounded different. A great example is David Garrick in the 18th century, who took the London stage by storm with his production of Richard III at Goodman's Field, an illegitimate theatre venue in the east of London. And he went on to become one of the great actors, the greatest actors of his generation. And he was haunted by critics throughout his career because of the way he sounded. Garrick was born and raised in the Midlands, and he never got rid of his native accent. But because of that, I argue in chapter 3 in my book, because of that, he sparked movements, reform movements, that changed not only the way in which Shakespeare sounded on stage, but also changed the fact that Shakespeare could finally be played outside the West End, outside the authorized theatres, because of the monopoly that Charles II had introduced in 1660 when the monarchy returned to England after the Civil War. So what's in an accent? A lot of history, and we should not forget that history. It will make us listen to Shakespeare again, and my overall sense, the message, the underlying message in the book, that acoustic diversity is not a minus, is a plus, and that all of us, actors, teachers, scholars, students of Shakespeare who happen to have an accent, we should feel like assets and not like misfits. Thank you.